Very good. This is this dreaded moment in the afternoon when you have to battle the lack of caffeine. So I hope you had quite a bit of coffee and are energized. We are certainly going to try to energize you. Hello, Ivan. I'm going to come back to you in a minute. So we've talked quite a bit about national level issues and how to deal with resilience. Finance Ministry is dealing with resilience at the national level, but of course, the international environment can be tremendously important in constraining or opening opportunities at the national level. And that international environment has become, as we have heard again and again these days, increasingly uncertain, unsettled. The institutions that have been created post-war to allow collective action to take place at the international level have sort of suffered, let's put it this way, this year, and it has become more difficult to come together behind common goals such as fighting climate change. So we want to turn a little bit to this question of how the global environment plays into the opportunities for fiscal action on resilience. And for that, we've invited Ivan Tiago Oliveira, Deputy Finance Minister in charge of sustainable finance in the Brazilian Finance Ministry, to join us for a conversation. And Ivan's role is particularly critical, and I don't know, Ivan, maybe you will tell us about it, has actually been created for that purpose, perhaps. At least been given a significant boost by the role that Brazil has played over the last couple of years at the global stage, first in the G20, and then this year in the context of COP30, in sort of driving the global agenda and very much driving that agenda behind climate and related topics. So Ivan and we have been working together quite a bit since last year's G20 on the MDB reform agenda, but then also on climate-related COP30 preparation agendas. We being ODI, global in various ways, and we have experienced Ivan and the incredible role he has been playing. So Ivan, we really look forward to hearing from you. Now, I'm going to essentially try to find out a bit, Ivan, how you got a mandate for playing that role at a global level, for being, in a way, sort of driving the global show in such a major way and committing Brazil behind it, taking domestic steps that increased your credibility in those global discussions. I would like to find out a little bit more about that, how the international and the national hang together. So perhaps, Ivan, welcome. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about the role that the G20 and the COP30 have been playing in Brazil in sort of enabling Brazil to take the initiatives that it has.
Thanks, Hans. A great pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, I could not be in person, but really happy to be here at the ODI Global Public Finance event. Well, let me give you a little bit of the background, and I think you touched a bit on that, on how we prepared ourselves to get to the G20, and at the end of the day, to the agenda that we continue to push now with the Circle of Finance Ministers for COP30. And you are right that in fact, since January 23, when President Lula came and Minister Haddad came to be the Minister of Finance of Brazil, there was a clear take that we really needed to connect the agenda of development, of dealing with poverty reduction, of growth and job creation, income creation, and that we really needed to deal with that connected with the sustainable agendas. That means essentially connecting climate in a broader sense to the economic development agenda of Brazil. So that's why Minister Haddad, since the very beginning, brought this idea of, creating a ecological transformation plan that would be the umbrella plan of President Lula's government, under which we would see all the connections with the sectoral plans from energy, nature, transportation, and so on. That would really make it quite clear where we would like to go. So, and that push, obviously, from the Minister of Finance is quite unique in many senses. We don't really see many ministers of finance leading the way as Minister Haddad is doing here in Brazil, in connecting the dots as strongly as we are doing in Brazil. And I'd say the ecological transformation plan is somehow this north that we had, and really helped us to structure the actions domestically and internationally on how we would flex muscles and use the Brazilian leadership in this very unique opportunity that we had. Essentially, we had the G20 presidency, we have the BRICS presidency, and the COP30 presidency in 2 years. So, and consecutively. So a great opportunity to really showcase, and more than that, really showcase what we could do together, but more than that, really go to action. That's also a critical point that the minister has always made, that is, plans are there to guide us to really do things, not to just be on paper. So under that umbrella of the ecological transformation plan, I'd say we have restructured the Ministry of Finance. So you're right that part of my division department here is absolutely new. So we have restructured the finance, the sustainable finance agenda of the Ministry of Finance, including bringing new people in and reinforcing the engagement also internally with different ministerial committees that we have now in Brazil that deal with that. So there is a structural, let's say, organizational change also to help support that. And all of that since January 23. So as we got to really, the second semester of 23 in defining the priorities of what our G20 presidency would be like, and especially when it comes to sustainable finance issues, that's where we really, started to see the dots being connected between what we were doing internally, domestically, with our plans, and what were the opportunities we'd like to go for internationally, using our G20 presidency as a critical push for that. So I do remember in September 23, when we went to the last meetings of the Indian presidency to bring our priorities to the members of the G20, it was interesting to see how, for example, and to give you a very concrete example, how the agenda of reforms of the multilateral climate funds would be central to the Brazilian presidency of the G20. So we brought as priority one to the Sustainable Finance Working Group agenda of the G20, the optimization of the concessional money that we have allocated in those multilateral climate funds. And it had a lot to do with our own experience here in this new structure that we have here at the Ministry of Finance in dealing with those funds since January 23. So we had a whole program with the CIFs, we had a whole engagement with the GCF, for example, to take the two big ones. And the hurdles that we started to face in order to make progress, even countries like Brazil with a lot of very strong institutions, with banks like BNDES or National Development Bank, a very solid agenda in the Ministry of Energy, for example, and had a program with the CIFs on energy. But too many hurdles in the process that definitely were not really, making the money get to impact in countries, especially in those countries that wouldn't have the institutions that we had to push ahead. So again, this is a very straightforward connection between the problems that we started to face in order to access concessional at the beginning of 23 and how we framed the agenda of the G20. This is a critical thing. We have concessional finance here that's not really, getting to the projects according to the country's interests and priorities. And so we set the agenda of the Sustainable Finance Working Group, also taking that into account. And it continues, as we will see, also in this push that we have for the COP30. So how can we really be more efficient in allocating concessional finance for developing countries, for the poorest countries and most vulnerable, but also for middle-income countries like Brazil, where we still need some concessional for specific purposes. And so this is a bit how, for us as this, to answer your first question, Hans, how we could see the evolving agenda domestically when it comes to the connection of plans, economic plans, climate agenda to the broader scenario of the G20. And then from the G20 onwards, I think reinforcing what we could build together in the G20 and going for implementation. Just to quote another point, and I come back to you, that is the agenda of the MDB's reform. That is absolutely critical. In ODI and you yourself, you played a very important role in helping us out frame that agenda. Obviously, we had a lot of efforts in the previous presidencies trying to deal with that, and we had CAF review. We had many experts bringing that to the table. But as a matter of fact, I think that's quite a concrete example of how we could push the banks to, with the G20 head to do more. For the first time, we have a concrete G20 document, consensual document in the G20 with clear recommendations for the stakeholders in the system to push ahead for reforms for bigger, better, more effective MDBs. And what is also very important there, and it also has to do with the way we're framing that domestically, but it's quite present, for example, in this international endeavor on the MDBs reform, that is, all of that is done with a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, bringing the key stakeholders to the table. We had the opportunity, to engage with all members, with different stakeholders that are part of the MDB system, some clients, some partners of the MDB system, with academia, think tanks that had some good ideas on how to push forward. And I think what we could end up having, for example, with the G20 roadmap, is a quite clear, I'd say, example of what countries like Brazil can do in trying to bridge all different stakeholders and bringing all the dots together to push for action. So that's how I would frame in this first answer to you, how things were moving from January 23 here in Brazil onwards, and how we could plug the domestic change to the international change that we'd like to make in using different opportunities in different fora.
Yes, thanks, Ivan. And I think one day one ought to do a case study for the schools of government out of that, because you have really, and we've seen this up close, you've leveraged the global agenda for national action. The MDBs are one example. You've made the MDBs work for Brazil. The creation of a country platform, so going ahead with the example, basically, which at the same time you've pushed through the G20 and continuing to push through the G20, which is now being embraced elsewhere. So making those connections was, I understand, politically also very important. Now, one thing that you've done, which is really quite extraordinary, is you have really pulled together the finance ministries to support the global climate agenda in a way that has not been there before. And perhaps in a way that allowed you to, if I may, because I'm not working for any institution, that allowed you to bypass the complications of the G20 and have the finance ministers help sort of design or input into the Baku to Belém roadmap. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, the Baku to Belém roadmap, the role that the circle of finance ministers that you created played, perhaps also how you see this going forward. Is this something that will stay with us or that is only a temporary phenomenon?
Thanks, Hans. Yes, that's a great question, and in fact allows me to reinforce the connections throughout the years in this joint international endeavor that we have, and you're all part of that, in fact. So yes, you're right that in the G20 we had already experienced that first, let's say, innovation that was connecting the ministers of finance to the ministers of environment and the ministers of foreign affairs under the task force on climate. So it was a first exercise to try to connect those worlds that are not well connected. We don't speak the same language quite often. We don't get to understand each other quite often. And I'd say the exercise in our G20 on specifically on that, and obviously quite concentrated on climate, was somehow a very good seed to what ended up being the Circle of Finance Ministers for COP30. And I'm going to get there in a minute. But just to give you an example of also a very concrete agenda that came out of that innovation in our G20 with the task force on climate, we have been, trying to go for action, as I have mentioned since the beginning. And there we saw an opportunity to discuss with the other ministries in different G20 ministries that were with us there, the concept of country platforms that was there for some time now, and some MDBs were flexing muscles around it. We had the JETPs and so on. But as a matter of fact, I think there were a couple of missing points that the task force on climate was of great help in order to bring a concrete and common understanding on how we would frame country platforms and what is the use that we could take out of those instruments to finance our transition. And one of the critical developments or outcomes of the task force on climate or clima, as we say, it was exactly this concept of country platforms entrenched, I'd say we're really not reframing completely, but essentially reinforcing three critical pillars of country platforms. That is, it needs to be country-led, it needs to be flexible, and it needs to be essentially a point of connectivity. So connectivity, flexibility, and country-driven is essentially the three pillars that we set, and we, together with the G20, we understood that were the principles to push for country platforms. But as you correctly mentioned, we went beyond the concept and we built our own country platform. We launched in DC last October, so it's 1 year old now, in a completely different way, but essentially taking those three pillars as integral part of it. So the Minister of Finance led it. We brought the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Mines and Energy in our case. We brought the Ministry of Environment and the Minister of Trade and Industry. So we have 4 ministries under the coordination of the Minister of Finance. And we set criteria for projects to be selected according to our plans. So again, our plans continue to be very relevant here. We have the ecological transformation plan, but we have the energy transition plan. We have some sub-sectoral plans that are connected to the climate plan in Brazil. And so we took the plans, we went to sectors, we got to subsectors, and we set criteria for projects to be assessed. And we built a secretariat using GCF's money. So it's a bit part of the process of assessing access to those funds, and a secretariat that is entrenched in BNDES. I'm not going to go too much into the details of the platform, but it's a very concrete way to see how we could use the G20, plug to ministries that are not very commonly together and can't understand very well each other together. We got to reinforce concepts, and we applied concepts to new instruments that are very important now in Brazil to finance our transition. Right now we have 16 projects in our platform, from energy to nature-based solutions, that are worth more than 23 billion US dollars, and we're essentially plugging all concessional money that we have access to the platform. So it became a very relevant, very relevant in the scenario of financing strategic and technologically challenging projects in Brazil. So this is the way we framed the way we used the engagement, also to reinforce that connection to domestic issues, as you correctly mentioned. But what you see is that with that background, essentially with what President Correa do Lago and the Minister Haddad, what they decided to do is that, all right, so we had the task force on climate, good engagement, I think, in connecting further the Minister of Finance to the climate agenda. Why don't we think about reinforcing that connection throughout our Brazilian COP30 presidency, and really, using the push from the Minister of Finance that are really, the heavy pens that we have now there to sign the difficult deals and regulation that could really make a difference when it comes to going to 1.3 trillion by 2035. That is the key goal of the Baku to Belém agenda, the call from COP29. So Minister Haddad took that call from President Correa do Lago and set the Circle of Finance Ministers agenda, that is essentially how to mobilize 1.3, in what are the key roles of different stakeholders So as you see, there is a straightforward connection to the agenda that we started with our G20. And now we're essentially pushing together with 36 ministers of finance that do represent quite well the whole world. Essentially, we have, all different kinds of countries in different regions well represented in the circle of finance ministers. And the call there is, again, for action. We have very concrete recommendations that are really reinforcing some of the recommendations that we already had in our G20 on MDBs reform, for example, on optimization of the climate funds, for example, on engagement with the private sector and how to really be innovative in boosting private sector mobilization in the process. So we set the scene to get to DC next week. And in fact, we have the ministerial of the Circle of Finance Ministers in DC on October the 15th, next week, when we're going to publish a report that is essentially based in 4 pillars. The first one has to do with concessional finance and optimization of the funds. So we're not recreating the wheel here. We're essentially say, let's move for action. Let's get part of the agenda of the G20 on optimization of the funds, and let's push ahead. Let's think about concession in this very challenging world that we have now, where concessionality is going to be a real problem, but it's continued to be very important for many countries, especially the most vulnerable and poor ones. The second pillar that has to do with MDBs reform. So essentially, we're saying, look, there are some parts of the roadmap from the G20 that maybe should reinforce here when it comes to mobilization of climate finance. And so why don't we reinforce that using the Circle of Finance Ministers and push ahead with the banks so that they can really do more here? And there is one critical point, that is private sector mobilization as critical part of the MDB's agenda. So that goes beyond, I'd say, the G20 roadmap itself, and really connects straight for the roadmap to the broader climate mobilization agenda of COP30. A third pillar that has to do with domestic capacity and building up country platforms. So again, we have a good case. Have been mobilizing a lot, many of the critical stakeholders worldwide on country platforms. The GCF especially, that's been a very important partner and player in this new wave of country platforms, of assessing how country platforms could be of help in pushing climate finance in developing economies. So there's this third pillar that is essentially, look, we need to think about domestic capacity. It connects well with some of fiscal issues and institutional issues domestically too, but it has to do with how to think about this specific instrument as part of the broader scenario of mobilization. There's a fourth priority essentially focused on innovation for private sector mobilization. We have been engaging a lot with the private sector throughout the year, in understanding better the hurdles, but also the solutions that the private sector itself was trying to come up, especially for FX risk mitigation, how to think about de-risking, how to think about blended finance differently. And in that sense, the platforms end up being a very good instrument to connect different dots of this puzzle. And the fifth priority has to do with regulatory issues. So essentially, we're bringing regulation as part of the solution. We're bringing taxonomies and carbon markets as part of the solution. It's there in the fifth priority of the Circle of Finance Ministers. Again, a report that is really focused on action, on implementation, but again, builds up on our collective efforts in the last couple of years in really pushing for reforms at a granular level and as effective as possible to make things go ahead. So, Hans, this is the way we have framed from the G20 to COP30, how we're seeing, this report that should be out next week as a good, opportunity or input from the ministers of finance to the COP30 process on how to really get 1.3 trillion. And we understand, and that's our point on how to move forward, and including under the Brazilian presidency that will end only in the next COP. In fact, we're just starting the presidency. So we intend to continue next year with the process of the Circle of Finance Ministers, using key points throughout the year and with key partners and stakeholders to push for implementation. For each of those 5 priorities, you'll see us together with you and many other partners reinforcing the call and taking stock and monitoring the process to see how we get to the next COP when it comes to the implementation of the many recommendations we should have out of the report that should be out next week. Thank you.
That's the great, Ivan. There are really two remarkable things here. One is, as you described, is to bridge the gap between finance ministries and foreign ministries, or if you want, the COP negotiators, which has been very large. That clearly negotiations at the COP in finance ministries weren't always thought of as committing them in the past. So you're building that bridge. The second thing that you're doing is you've created a coalition of the willing in a fairly divided world. And that's something which be interesting to understand also a little bit better from you. Is that kind of plurilateralism, bringing together those willing to move ahead, is that something which is, how do you build collective action in this current context? Was that something which came naturally to these other finance ministers to come together? Was there, what was the nature of the strong arming that Brazil did? How did you build these coalitions?
That's a good question, Hans. Maybe the process from the G20 again on helped us, to create a way forward that was easier than obviously if you weren't able to be at the presence of the G20. But maybe also, and that's something I like to think about or to think that it is true. There's something about countries like Brazil that do play a critical role in connecting different, stakeholders of different parts of the world. Because at the end of the day, there are many of our priorities that are well aligned to, traditional developing countries' agenda. But there are many others that are quite well entrenched in what you'd consider a developed country agenda. So that's why for us, somehow it ends up being, and it has to do maybe with the history of the Brazilian economic diplomatic agenda, or how the country is built and how we are part of a, let's say, marginal Occident, but also quite connected to the South-South agenda and so on. But the critical point here is really that we are in a position where we can talk to the UK and be quite well aligned on many issues, and talk to India and be very well aligned with many other issues, and fine tuning where we could get the common ground to bring everybody together is obviously the tricky part here. And maybe not many countries are well positioned to do that in the world right now. So maybe it has nothing to do with myself, my team, or even the Minister Haddad himself. It has to do with this role that Brazil ends up playing, in being a very honest broker, very straightforward, but also having all those connections that really help us move forward in a very challenging scenario that we have ahead of us. So yes, we have Barbados with us, we have India with us in the circle, we have the UK, we have France. So it's interesting to see how we could manage. We have China with us. How we could manage to bring together, and obviously I can tell you from the Minister of Finance, I think the approach tends to be more coherent and consensual than it is in the negotiating room at COP30, because there it tends to be more of a principist approach, and that's maybe not very good for the negotiations. But the good news is that when it comes to finance, I think we're finding new ways or reinforcing ways where we can really see developing countries and developed countries moving together to do things. What we need to do is to do things. So the critical point is that, and we could say that also in our G20, we want the MDBs to do more. We want them to go riskier. We want them to mobilize private sector. We want them to make their operations a lot faster. We want them to connect their operations a lot more to the priorities of the country. In that sense, the country platforms will end up helping a lot too. We want the funds to, you know, facilitate access, and the money needs to go out. Just to give you an example, funny and bad example that we have with the CIFs for the Renewable Energy Integration Program. The first penny out of the renewable energy integration programs from the climate investment funds that was launched 6 years ago was invested in Brazil this year. So it is a program that is not, you know, delivering anything. It started to deliver something, including a very important part of Brazil, that is the Pecém port in the northeast, where we have plenty of projects on energy, for example, on hydrogen and green hydrogen and so on. But that's the kind of scenario that we start to see, you know, real change. So we've seen the CIFs itself as an institution moving forward. Right now we have the industry decarbonization program with the CIFs, and things are moving a lot smoother and a lot faster. So that's also the great news, I think, that we have. So not only we're connecting the right dots and the stakeholders, but that coalition of the winning, as you correctly mentioned, somehow, you know, taking who is really willing to do something and push ahead is maybe the right way to frame the agenda globally in the years to come. Because there's a lot, at the end of the day, there's a lot that really bridges us, that really brings us together, much more than, I'd say, what really keeps us apart. And those bridges we're happy to be, you know, helping from our side to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we all very much hope that Brazil, which is like everybody's friend, right? That's basically what you were saying. And that's a great position to be in. It's a great position out of which to lead. You need to continue leading. And for the finance ministries, it's a particularly sort of unusual thing to lead globally, because finance ministries are conservative and they tend to be a bit risk averse in those contexts. So for the finance ministry to do that is great. Finance ministries think in positive sum games. I think I mentioned to you the negotiators, mostly lawyers in the COP elsewhere, they think in zero-sum games. The positive sum game of sort of the economist and finance vision is really sorely needed there. So with this, Ivan, if you're okay, we're going to turn to the room. I'm sure there will be some interesting interventions and questions here. We have the usual thing. We have our microphone here. Ratin, I see you are getting ready to ask a question.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah, wait.
Thank you, Senor Oliveira. That was very interesting discussion. But my question is actually a political one, since you're a politician. What are we going to do about the United States?
Should I answer it now? Or should
that was an easy one.
take a block?
We'll take a few, Ivan, if you want. Then you can decide which ones you answer. Frédéric, please.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Great presentation and great discussion, really. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the BRICS and that alliance. And you mentioned, of course, that you were heading the BRICS, and reading a little bit the outcome of the discussion, it looked like the BRICS were quite willing to take the lead on climate, maybe in a way that is more of a difficulty in the COP setting. So I would like to hear, how do you compare now maybe the G20 and the BRICS, and where do you see this alliance going?
Good. There's another one who I know wants to ask a question. That's Michael.
You want me to ask a question?
Yes.
Hi, Ivan. Michael Jacobson, ODI. I want to get real a little bit, because this is a fantastic story, what Brazil has done. But it's not every country has played the game. The TF Klima was a great innovation of having climate and finance ministers meeting together, sometimes for the first time from the same country. And it was difficult because the finance ministers and climate ministers didn't always agree. And this time round, you only went for finance ministries. So the Circle of Finance Ministers, despite being an input to the Baku to Belém roadmap, which was a UNFCCC climate mandated process, was just the finance ministries. And the engagement has been patchy. Not everybody's turned up at every meeting. And you've had some red lines put through your document in the last week. So, and this is because it's difficult. But I just wondered whether you found the process of working with finance ministries on their own easier or more difficult than when they're with their climate ministries to engage with climate-related goals. Because we're going to have to try doing this again, and you've already now tried 2 models, which is 2 more than anybody else has tried.
Excellent. Yes, Ivan, so we have a question about the one that is not a member of the Circle of Finance Ministers. We have a question about the relationship with the climate ministries and you know how you see that from Michael, and on the BRICS, the role of that you played with the BRICS and how that might have helped in this context.
Great, Hans. Great to see many friends there. So let me start from the end with Michael's take. And well, first off, everything's quite real here, Michael, what we're doing. I think as real as possible at the end of the day. As you can see, we're moving a lot beyond just negotiations and text. We're really doing things and pushing by example. That's the critical point. And as you could see, and you can check in our, let's say, very interesting agenda of doable things that we have already done connected to the G20, BRICS, and COP30 agenda. Second, obviously, I thought your question would be harder since you started with the real thing. But obviously, it is a lot easier to deal with ministers of finance and the language, the approach. What happened, I think, with our Circle of Finance Ministers, that we ended up also helping the countries themselves to connect better the ministers to the negotiators, because at the end of the day, there are some issues they had to go and check internally how the negotiators were thinking, things like that, and so that's a good thing, I think, internally for all the members that have been engaging. We've been hearing from some countries in that sense. That is a good way to even internally to connect better the ministers of finance to the ministers of environment and foreign affairs that are generally leading the way in COP negotiations. So definitely a lot easier. As you know, the report is there. I think what we tried to do throughout the last 6 months or so, that we're essentially negotiating that, in a lot of engagement with the private sector too, with academia, think tanks, also with civil society. We had 3 events with civil society. We had an open forum for them to send their comments and ideas on the priorities of the circle and so on. So I think nobody can really say that they didn't have the chance to bring the ideas and perspectives to the Circle of Finance Ministers report. But what we try to do as a presidency of the circle is really to incorporate as much as possible of all critical issues for the members, to let them feel as much as possible that their ideas and interests well embedded in the final version of the report that's going to be out next week. But also taking, the presidential lead and push. That is, there were some issues that we needed to take the decision to keep there and move forward, although some countries were not so much comfortable with them. And that's why we essentially decided to have a consensual statement on a minimum push from the ministries in DC on the key messages out of the circle. And we have a report that is, again, very well based on the critical ideas and interests that were brought by the members and different stakeholders in the process. But we took the lead to say, look, this is up until here we can go. Beyond here, we want to keep it, or we want to take it out, because we understand as the presidency that it should be in or out. So, but it's been working quite well. To be quite frank, I think we have a lot of support in the process, and I'm confident that the ministerial in DC and some of the meetings we should have around the Circle of Finance Ministers report in São Paulo the first week of November, just before COP Leaders Summit, and also in Belém on the 14th and 15th of November, are going to really reverberate the report, but I'd say in very actionable terms. So the agenda in São Paulo is for the minister to be there to really launch a couple of new initiatives, funds, and things like that are connected straightforward to the recommendations of the report. The agenda in Belém is also to do so. We are bringing critical players to Belém to really, launch a bunch of new country platforms, a whole new agenda of coordination on country platforms, for example, and a South-South knowledge hub that should be launched there too. So there is very concrete and real issues going on, a lot beyond the report, but the report itself is also very, very pleasant to see how we could bring, and engage with all critical stakeholders and members, and really I'd say that they see the reflection of their ideas well put there in the report. On the second point on the BRICS, yes, we have been engaging a lot throughout our presidency. We had a different presidency this year because the presidency is a 1 year long, but we ended up having a 6-month long presidency or around that because of the summit in Rio in July, exactly because we didn't want to have 2 summits by the end of the year, COP 30 and the BRICS. But just to give you one very straightforward example of what we could do with the BRICS, we essentially brought to the BRICS discussions during our presidency all the 5 priorities of the Circle of Finance Ministers, and we could push for the first time in the BRICS history for a consensual technical note that was endorsed by the ministers at the ministerial in Rio on climate finance. So I can tell you it was of great help in the process, because at the end of the day, you can read the BRICS, and if you bring it to, if you Google it, you get to the note, but you can see there the BRICS take on MDB's reform, concessional finance and optimization of the funds, the agenda on country platforms, the agenda of private sector mobilization and regulatory issues. So we really built momentum within the BRICS on the critical issues for the circle, and we could continue the process within the circle also with a broader audience. So there's a straightforward connection between the deliveries in our BRICS and the report of the circle at the end of the day. But more than that, again, this is real, this is for action. We built the BRICS multilateral guarantees. So essentially, the Brazilian presidency, once again, was innovative in the way that we wanted to build a new institution to really push the BRICS cooperation on finance beyond what we had right now. And the agenda on guarantees is very important, as we all know. It's right there in the report too, also on how to really be more efficient in mobilizing private sector capital. And we essentially, we saw that there was a space for the BRICS, to lead on that too. So essentially, we have approved and endorsed by the ministers and the leaders in Rio the build-up of the BRICS multilateral guarantees that should be essentially bringing the new development bank to do guarantees and restructure, probably in the years to come, in a new institution, a MIGA-like institution, an agenda of guarantees to push for private sector mobilization among the BRICS countries. So we essentially started a process to build the MIGA of the BRICS. And that's a very concrete agenda. And right now in the New Development Bank, we're working on that to come with the first pilot by December, for example. So very concrete terms for the BRICS. And again, straightforward connection to the action agenda of the COP30 and Circle of Finance of Ministers. but also to the report itself. And one last point on the US. In fact, the US must welcome. I think President Lula had a good conversation with President Trump recently, and he has invited Trump to come to Belém. Maybe that would be a good opportunity to see how, and that's something I've been reinforcing. I was in New York for New York Climate Week in a couple of events there where the private sector say, look, the agenda between development and climate should not be divided. Brazil has been showing, at least since January 23, that's exactly what we're doing. We're bringing jobs, we're bringing growth, we're bringing income, but we're connecting all that to the agenda of climate. And that's, again, entrenched in our domestic agenda and it is entrenched in our international agenda. So more than happy to see the US engaging with us next year, maybe in the Circle of Finance Ministers implementation agenda. That would be of great help, I think, for the G20 agenda too.
Absolutely, Ivan. We're all looking forward to that. And I have a couple of questions from online here, if I may. And so one goes a bit in this direction of next year. So once the G20 and the COP are out of the way, do you see the Circle of Finance Ministers playing a role in the future? Could this become sort of a forum to get things done, as you say, to push things forward in a coalition of willing parties? Take an example. Could that be a vehicle to create coalitions on the boards of the IMF, of the MDBs, to pursue this agenda and have sort of majorities on those boards, or in other fora? What's sort of the future? So that's one question here. Another one is, with the finance ministers getting so proactive on the climate agenda, so on the climate finance agenda, are there any implications that you see for skills and governance and your building capacity of finance ministries? What's your message to finance ministries if that is to become sort of a more important role in the future than it has been in the past for those ministries? And then finally, and so somewhat ambitious here, whether you can leverage this process to redesign the global financial architecture. And there are sort of long-standing issues on the global financial architecture, the voice of countries, of emerging markets, developing countries in the global institutions, regulatory issues, etc. Can you see a global financial architecture emerging from these beginnings?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Hans. Very, very interesting questions. On the way forward, let's see. Obviously, we already have a couple of engagements, like the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, that is very important, and we're part of since 23. We've been engaging a lot with them, and they have been doing also, I think, a great job. Part of the agenda on capacities in building capacities within the ministries. Your second question. So, but I think what is critical for the Circle now is really to finish this round with the Brazilian presidency. So I think having it by to the next COP and the finish line for the Brazilian presidency is going to be important. Essentially, as in a way to connect to all four. In fact, we don't want to replace any existing forum or like. We want to use the power of ministers of finance, especially when it comes to international issues, to push for implementation and action. In a sentence, that would be the critical point. So we have a report. We would like to engage with the American G20 that should have, MDB's reform also there. We'd like to engage with other fora. We'd like to continue our engagements in the annual meetings. We'd like to engage with the G7. I had a great conversation with colleagues from the G7, and France is preparing an agenda that's quite convergent with many of the issues that we're going to present in the report. So I think maybe having that special group as we go from Belém to the next COP as a group that can reinforce the agenda of implementation wherever it is necessary, that's the best way to frame it. Whether we should continue with that in the years to come, it's really, I think, up to the next COP presidency to see how they would like to frame it or not. But what we definitely would like to see is that within a year we should have a lot of implementation. We should really see, things starting to change in all different sets of agendas that we have under the report, and even going beyond, right? So there are great opportunities to continue, and we're not covering everything. Just again, and starting to touch on your third point, Hans. We're not, covering everything. There's a lot on many relevant issues, including on that, for example, that I'd say that would need a lot more of a push, including from the Minister of Finance in different fora. So it's not really that we're solving all the problems and magic will come up from our delivery, but it is that we are here to change. We're doing what is possible to change. We're taking all the opportunities and bringing all the stakeholders that really want to change with us. And that's the way I'd say I would frame this next year of the circle, and the connections we intend to have with all, again, different fora, including with the Coalition of Finance Ministers, that tends to be more connected to the domestic issues. And there, I think there is a good, complementarity between the two initiatives. I think the coalition is a lot more on what you're doing internally and how could showcase that to the world and what are the possibilities to connect around that. The circle is pretty much around international issues, how could push together. Maybe what we could also see at the end of this year is the coalition also taking that role, and again, we'd be happy to reinforce the engagement and the support to the coalition itself. So I'd say no closed answer here. The real answer that we can give now is that we're delivering the report, we're delivering action in DC, in São Paulo, in Belém. We'll continue to push for action throughout next year, and let's see where we will land at the end of next year, and whether there's a need for such a circle of finance ministers or not, right?
Great. Ivan, in the room, I have a question to you. Maybe you could say something, Ivan, about the Tropical Forests Forever facility. That is sort of the second big deliverable, as I see it from on the Brazilian side for this COP. And where that stands, are you making progress? What are your expectations for that? And where do you see that in the overall architecture of climate finance?
Great, Hans. Great question. Yeah, we have 5 priorities from the Minister of Finance when it comes to the agenda of action where that is in our hands. So going beyond what we're pushing the others to do. The first one is the Tropical Forest Forever facility. As you mentioned, it is essentially the team in the executive secretariat to take care of it. But right now, as you've seen, President Lula has committed $1 billion to the facility. I think the point now is really working on the financial model and really showcasing how effective it can be so that some other countries could come. In New York, we had at least 2 or 3 countries that seems to be willing to come before COP and also announce their pledges to the facility. As I understand now, it's more of a technical, political issue to showcase how the financial model works and really bring those countries that have already emphasized it, they would like to be part of that solution. I think that's a great idea in general. The idea of using a new mechanism that we get the right pricing, the right financial framing accordingly. But getting something new to finance forests and where you can really deal with them alive, not dead. So that's why I think President Lula has really taken the lead and brought that to one of the critical deliveries that goes beyond the Minister of Finance. It's really, I'd say, a critical delivery for COP30 this year. It is well placed there in the report under Pillar 4, where we see innovative instruments to finance transition and in nature. Something important to mention to you is that the report is really about climate. So we're really taking adaptation across the board, taking mitigation there, obviously. So climate adaptation, resilience is really there, quite present. But nature is also there. And nature was also part of our agenda in the G20. So priority 4 of our sustainable finance working group was on nature for the first time. We had nature there. The South African G20 went forward and continued with that. But that's also a linkage that Brazil is doing quite strongly. That is, we're not thinking about mitigation and nature as absolutely different parts of the equation. We're bringing everything together as part of this agenda on transition. And again, in very concrete and real terms, that's what we see in our country platform. So we have energy there that is critical for transition, but we have nature-based solutions in bioeconomy. So also in the report, you see that nature is entrenched there, and that's interesting to see. So TFFF is one of the 5 key points from the Ministry of Finance. We have the agenda of integration of carbon markets also there, the very important one. We're trying to reinforce coalitions on carbon markets, trying to think about how we could in mid-long term think about integration of the markets. Obviously, markets that are really, well structured, and we're doing that as we build our own compliance market. So it's a very important part of the agenda for us. The minister would like to see our market starting from the beginning as a market that would be open or ready to engage with other markets to see how we could, integrate. A third point has to do with taxonomy. So interoperability of taxonomy is also there. Brazil is pushing also on there. There's a fourth that has to do with country platforms. So essentially having a package on country platforms to bring to Belém that has to do with the launch of new country platforms, formalizing a coordination group on country platforms from now to next year, but also building up a South-South knowledge hub so that we share with other countries that are willing to build up their own country platforms the problems that we have faced, and also maybe fast tracks that they could take if they'd like to do something that is like our own country platform, for example. And there is a fifth point that has to do with levies and how we could use levies around climate finance, leveraging climate finance through levies. So those 5 issues, TFFF, carbon markets, taxonomies, platforms, and levies are part of the agenda that the minister himself will bring to Belém in very concrete terms, and really hope to see some of you in DC, maybe some of you in São Paulo, and also in Belém to help us deliver action. That's the critical point here.
Yeah. No, sure you will. And we're all grateful for the title. Tropical Forest Forever is just so much better than all the other technocratic facilities, etc., that we have. And Brazil is, of course, particularly interesting among the large economies in that most of the emissions, the net emissions in Brazil, come not from coal power plants or transport or any, but from the destruction of the rainforest, which is kind of interesting. Of course, there are some other countries that would be in a similar situation. We have one last question. We have 2 minutes left, Ivan. One last question from the floor. Yes, please.
Giving me this opportunity, and thank you very much for your presentation. I just want to seek clarity whether I understood you right, that you are restructuring Ministry of Finance to be able to handle the new agenda. And if so, I just wanted to know whether you've thought about whether in the medium and long term, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I'm going to share the example of Uganda, whether you might lose the focus and probably focus on implementation. Why am I asking this? In Uganda, when we're addressing most of the international agendas, which required a lot of donor funding, I was working in Ministry of Finance then, about 20 years ago. We would set up secretariats for private sector development, for rural fund formation units, and so many others, because we thought that we are best fit to mobilize the resources and even environment. But we had the positive vision, and we thought would be best to do. But when it came to implementation, it was so difficult because the sector ministries did not feel motivated to pursue the implementation. Have you thought about that? I just wanted to seek your views.
That's a great question. Thank you. Ivan, you have 4 seconds.
All right.
We'll run a little bit over.
Straight to the point. Yes, you know, we have reformed the ministry in January 23. So I have a whole area under my coordination that is on sustainable finance. Essentially, I have 8 people that really do a great work in connecting all the dots internally, internationally, dealing with sustainable finance. But that structure is a permanent structure of the Ministry of Finance now. But for the new initiatives, and just to let you know, the platform, for example, the Brazilian investment platform, we have created a secretariat that is independent from the ministries, that is financed by GCF readiness money that we have placed there, also with the help of Bloomberg Philanthropies, that is also financing part of the colleagues that are staff of the secretariat of the BIP. And we also have our National Development Bank, BNDES, that has allocated 5 very good professionals from different areas that are there in the secretariat. So we have built a secretariat that's not dependent on the Ministry of Finance. It's essentially independent and has funding for the years to come to run and do the work that the platform has to do. And in that sense, we have the continuity somehow assured, given the structure that we have now in the years to come, even with the changing political cycle, for example. So that's the way we have framed it. Very good question, but it's less on our hands, for example, the platform, a lot more in this structure that we have been able to create independently from the ministries.
Ivan, thank you very much. Thanks for the time that you've given us. Thanks for all these really interesting insights.
Thanks, Hans. A real pleasure to be with you. Hopefully next year I'll be there in person.
Very good. And if you were here, I would invite you to a coffee now, which we're going to do with this group. So bye-bye, and I hope to see you again around this table.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And for the room, we have only a 15-minute break, minus 2 minutes. So either you stay or you get yourself the coffee. Let's be very efficient before the last panel of the day. All right. Thank you, everyone.